My name is Dean Budnick. I'm from Relix, and I want to thank you all again for joining us for the third annual Live Music Conference. And in thinking about that and looking to my left, stage left, your right, I want to point out Mr. Bradley Tucker, who brought this, really founded this event and has seen it through. He's done an amazing job with a team of wonderful people, but this really was Brad's vision, and he's executed on it delightfully over the years. And speaking of delightful, right next to me, I have Mr. Roger McNamee. I'm sure that a number of you know Roger as a musician for his work most recently in Moon Alice and Dewey Decimal System, and sort of along these lines, he's really made a commitment to the realm of poster art and continues to support that and has enabled people to continue making their livelihoods producing poster art, which is wonderful. You may or may not know that he owns 4 patents in the realm of sending music to mobile devices.
Live streaming.
Live streaming, which is another extraordinary story. But above and beyond that, I think other individuals probably know Roger best for his role as a technology investor based in Silicon Valley. And he's worked for probably most notably Silver Lake Partners, Elevation Partners over the years. And when I think of Roger and all that he's done, I sort of jump back to the date August 9th, 1995, in which people remember that day for 2 reasons. I think there are certain individuals, probably many people here, who think of that date. That's the day that Jerry Garcia passed away. And for other individuals, that's the date of the Netscape IPO. And we'll always look at that particular. Thankfully, the two are unrelated. But I think a lot of people think back to that. And it's within the context of all of this, I reckon, but certainly Roger's role as a technology investor and one of the early advisors to Facebook, that he ultimately has written this book, Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. And what I'd like to do today is talk to Roger a bit about this, along with some other things. I'm going to start in the present and then jump back to his early days at Silicon Valley. And parenthetically, he is a technical advisor to the HBO TV series Silicon Valley. So maybe we can ask him a question about that as well. We'll have questions from the audience at the very end. But Roger, in many respects, people have long thought of you, and I believe you've thought of yourself as really a technology optimist. And it seems like a lot of that changed sort of in the roll-up to this book. Can you talk a little bit about that and where we're at today?
Yeah, so Dean, I have always been a technology optimist. And I was convinced growing up when I did that technology was going to empower all of us and make democracy better. It was going to make life better in a million different ways. And for the first 25 or 30 years of my professional career, that was the case. And what I discovered a number of years ago is that the culture of the Valley changed, and changed in a really profound and very disturbing way. It went from the sort of hippie libertarianism of Steve Jobs, which was all about empowering individuals. So that's really what we saw through 2000. And that's been replaced by a form of libertarianism that's all about building global monopolies. It's this really money-driven, power-driven model that in its early days didn't seem that dangerous. And as it grew, all of a sudden we began to see issues. And the way I would describe it, and I think for all of you who use these products today, what you have to imagine is that the value system, as espoused by Google, works like this. Google says the world is full of inefficiency. It's full of unhappiness. And if only we could convert all human experience, everybody's life, into data and run it through machine learning and artificial intelligence, we can create order in the world. We can get rid of the inefficiency, we can get rid of the uncertainty that's plaguing everybody, and we'll all be a million times better off. And people go, huh, okay, that's a philosophy. But let's think about what that means. Anybody here use Google Maps? Yes, of course you do, right? We all use Google Maps. So why? Because it's a genius application. It knows where you're going to go first thing in the morning. But if you step back and think about what that product is for Google, it's something very different than you think. So Google's collected all the data that exists about you. It knows a ton, so it can tell you in the morning where you're going to go. And it suggests a route. And some mornings you look at it and you go, wow, that's not the route I would have expected. That looks like a longer route. And they say, no, no, trust us, this is the right way to go. So here's what's going on. Google is playing God. And in order to play God, you have to look at all the people and all the routes, and you have to move people around the various routes to keep them from getting too clogged up, which means some of the time they are sending you on an inferior route that they know is inferior to protect the timeliness of other people. Now, my point to you here is maybe you think that's okay, maybe you don't. But do you think of Google as playing God in your life? Because that is their goal. And they do this with every product they've created. I mean, let's think about, you know, whether it's Street View, right? They drive up and down the street with a camera, taking a picture of your house, your dog, your kid, your car. And they say, we own this. And then they do satellite view. And they take a picture from the top. And they say, we own this. Then they did Google Glass, right? And they put this thing on people in order to capture data. And think about this for a moment. What's the purpose of the person wearing Google Glass? It's to look like a dork, right? What's the purpose of Google? They want to do facial recognition on every single person that the wearer sees, and they want to track every single little thing that person does to capture that human experience as data. Now, that didn't work, so you know what they did? They went back into the lab. They repackaged it as a video game. They spun it out as a separate company called Niantic. The game was called Pokemon Go. And the next thing you know, 1 billion people are going around like this, hours at a time, capturing facial recognition of every single person they ran into, capturing every minute detail of their behavior for Google. And what do they do next? They do some experiments. Hey, what if we put a Pokemon on private property? Will you knock on a stranger's front door? Turns out you will.
Well, I got a Snorlax, so it was okay.
And if they put it over a fence, will you climb a fence? Yeah, it turns out even Dean will climb a fence. And then they say, well, we'll go to Starbucks, they'll pay us money, and then we'll put a Pokemon in a Starbucks and see if people will buy coffee. And the answer is yes, they will. Now, this was the largest behavioral manipulation experiment ever run, 1 billion people. And my point is, not one of those people playing the game realized that they were being experimented on. And the reason why I've become an activist, the reason why I, a lifelong technology optimist, am here today, is because we may decide this is good, we may decide it's not good, but we've never had a conversation about it. All of this has happened beyond our ability to see it. And I think that's fundamentally unfair. And so I realized that I had to take the fact that I knew this and share it with everyone and see if we couldn't have a conversation before it was too late.
But really, I did get a Snorlax. They're very rare. So I'm very happy with that. So all of this is in the present. Let's think about how you even ended up, right? You grew up in the Northeast, you attended school in the Northeast, and eventually you found your way out in Silicon Valley. Can you talk about the origins of how that came about?
Well, yeah, I had older brothers and sisters who were 12, 10, 8 years older than me, which means when I'm a kid, I was born in 1956. By the time I was 12 years old, the Grateful Dead were playing on the stereo in the house, right? And my brothers and sisters were going to see, the Dead, the Airplane, Jimi Hendrix. They were going to Woodstock, and I wasn't old enough to go to those things, and I just couldn't stand it. It was driving me crazy. So when I turned 17 in 1973, that was when Watkins Glen happened. And I persuaded my mom that if I could talk my brother into taking me, I could go to Watkins Glen. And I had, let's just say Owsley Stanley and I had an interesting day that day. And when you're 17, you have no idea how exciting that can be. And to me, California it was like Chuck says, it was the promised land. And I first went out there in 1976, and I lived there for 2.5 years. And that's when I first, started collecting posters. And, it was, I didn't have any money, but you didn't need any money because that was it's the world of miracles.
Obviously, you're a musician. You have an appreciation for the improvisational rock of Grateful Dead and all that. I'm curious if you could talk about...
But I was into the culture too, right? I mean, and this is a really important thing because Silicon Valley came out of that, right? The same forces that created the music scene in San Francisco rolled over into Silicon Valley. I mean, this was the soundtrack of Silicon Valley. If you think about Atari, Atari was the first company that had the hippie value system. It was the first company where people smoked weed at work. And then Apple gets formed after that. And that whole thing, they were bringing that whole cultural vibe into Silicon Valley right as the microprocessor was beginning to happen, which creates video games, then personal computers, and then everything that follows. And to me, that was just... I just had to be there. I was a shitty engineer. I mean, I really was no good at math, but I had to be around this scene because it brought together both my passion for the creative aspects of tech and my passion for the creative aspects of music.
Well, if you think about like the well, right? The whole Earth electric link.
Exactly.
And how that tied together the culture and the music of the Grateful Dead and the fans.
It wasn't just adjacent. It's the same people, right? I mean, and that's the thing, right? It's like when I first became an analyst, the way I broke into the Silicon Valley scene socially was that they had jam sessions at every single industry conference and trade show. And I happened to stumble on one at the beginning of my career. The thing was, everybody had been in a band in college, but they'd all stopped playing. And I was still playing, and I was still playing happy hour shows. So I knew hundreds of songs. They knew like maybe one verse, one chorus. So I became like a hub in the jam sessions, and it would be people like Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, and Philippe Kahn, the founder of Borland, and all these other bigwigs in the tech industry. And there's no other way I could have gotten into that scene except for music, because we all grew up with the same music, the same drugs, we like to do the same things, right? And that's why that was such a fun scene.
You mentioned in the book that Paul Allen will only play Hendrix songs?
Yeah, in those days, I mean, it wasn't like he would only play Hendrix, but he would mostly only play Hendrix, and he was really good at it. I mean, he was so devoted and so incredibly shy. It was really hard to get him to come out and play, but when he did, he just shredded. It was a beautiful thing.
Sort of continuing the narrative, there's a moment that sort of brings together the Grateful Dead, Bono, and Sheryl Sandberg, future COO of Facebook. Can you talk about what happened there?
Yeah, so if any of you guys have read Neil Selvin's book about the years after Jerry died, there was a period of time starting in late '98 when the Grateful Dead asked me to help with their business because, there was no tour and they still had like 60 employees and they wanted to keep everybody employed. Initially, somebody brought him a big real estate project, but I didn't know anything about real estate. So I said, hey, how about if I just help you on technology? So the idea was we were going to take Dead.net, invest in the technology, make it a lot more modern and capable, and then syndicate it to all these other bands. So Dave Matthews and Phish and Bob Dylan and, Pearl Jam, all these different bands I went around to talk to with Peter McQuaid and the other people at Grateful Dead Productions. And Bono heard about this. And he said, I want to hear about this guy who's helping bands sell directly to their fans. And he at the time, he was working on a project where the US, the British, the French, the Italians, the Spanish, the Swiss, and the Germans were going to forgive the debt of emerging countries that were never going to be able to pay it back. And they were going to use the millennium, the year 2000, as the excuse. It was a really beautiful piece of philanthropy. And the person who was helping him at the U.S. Treasury Department was the chief of staff to the Secretary of the Treasury. And that happened to be Sheryl Sandberg. And so Sheryl and Bono do this thing, like forgiving tens of billions of dollars in debt, essentially reviving the economies of like a dozen little countries. And Bono says to Sheryl, I've got to find this guy in California. He's working with the Grateful Dead. And Sheryl says, I've never met him, but I know who he is because my brother-in-law works for him and is working on that project. And so Sheryl effectively introduces Bono to me, and I meet him the morning after they win the Grammy for Beautiful Day. And here's the really embarrassing thing. I was a deadhead, right? I didn't listen to much else. I mean, I'd listen to Hot Tuna and I'd listen to, The Airplane. Exactly. Thank you. I couldn't have named a U2 song, okay? But I meet them. It's 10 o'clock in the morning, and we're in the offices of Morgan Stanley, an investment bank in Los Angeles. They must have been up all night long because they just won a Grammy, having not had anything positive happen for like the prior 5 years. So this was a huge deal. They were back in size, right? And they come into this meeting, and the first thing Bono says is like, you know what really bothers me? I go, no, what? He goes, everybody thinks that music is what the kids are buying, but that's bullshit. They've bought some really great piece of hardware, and music is what shows off the hardware to the girls. He says, if you think about it, the Beatles made hi-fi really amazing. Pink Floyd made stereo sound really amazing. The Allman Brothers and everybody else, the Eagles, made car stereo sound incredible. He said, you know what's going on now? I go, I have no idea. He goes, subwoofers. That's what he called them, subwoofers. He said, and the hip-hop guys beat us to it. I feel so stupid. And I'm going, holy shit, this guy's really smart. And so anyway, I was really, really impressed. So I decided I was going to go and listen to a U2 album and find out what they played. And I liked it. And I went to, I don't know, I've probably been to 50 shows by now. But one thing led to another, and eventually he became my partner.
You opened for U2, did you not?
Yeah, we did. He did. He invited us to do a show on the 360 tour, which was the one with that giant spider on the stage. 126 semi-trucks and like 60 buses. It was definitely a global warming nightmare. And but yeah, that was a thrill. That's the only time I played a show in a stadium. And, we didn't use in-ear monitors. And so you had to really, it was a lucky thing. Our sound check was longer than the show, and we needed every minute of it because you have to get used to the slap back because the Oakland Stadium was just like a concrete wall.
So the company that you founded was Elevation
Yeah.
with Bono. And it was while you were working there that you first had your introduction to come out and meet Mark Zuckerberg. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So imagine this, right? It's 2006. Anybody here seen the Social Network movie? So it's like 6 months after the end of the timeline of that movie. And I get an email from a guy at Facebook. Now keep in mind, the company's 2 years old. It's got 9 million members, all high school students and college students. And it had 9 million in total revenues. So it's like teeny. I'm not even on it yet. But I get this message, and he says, my boss is a crisis. Would you take a meeting with him? And I was really psyched for it because they required real identity. And I was convinced the reason every prior social network had failed, from the Well to AOL to Friendster to MySpace, was because they get overrun by trolls and bullies who use anonymity as a shield. And I was convinced that Zuck was going to have a business bigger than Google was at that time. So I was psyched for the meeting. He comes to my office. And you know the incredible thing? He looked just like Mark Zuckerberg. He's got the sandals. He's got the skinny jeans. He's got the T-shirt, the hoodie, courier bag. He sits down. I sit down. It's actually, Dean and I, imagine we pivoted our chairs so we were facing each other. We're about this far apart. So our knees are like 3 feet apart. Comfy chairs in this living room style conference room at Elevation. I say, Mark, before you say anything, I got to tell you why I took this meeting. He's 22, I'm 50. I go, if it hasn't already happened, either Microsoft or Yahoo is going to offer $1 billion for Facebook, and everybody you know, from your parents to your board of directors to your best friends, they're all going to tell you, take the money. It's $1 billion. You'll have $650 million. You're 22. You'll change the world. Your venture investor is going to tell you he'll back your next company. It'll be way better than Facebook. I said, Mark, there are 2 things I've learned in my 24 years as a tech investor. One is there's nobody, not Steve Jobs, not anybody, who's ever had the perfect idea at the perfect time twice. It's not going to happen to you. And I think this is the perfect idea at the perfect time. You're going to be bigger than Google. And then I said, the second thing is, no matter who buys this company, they're going to wreck it. So if you believe in your vision, you're just going to have to follow it through. So I've just laid this incredibly heavy trip on a 22-year-old kid I've never met, right? Best advice I've ever given anybody. I'm expecting some feedback. What do I get? Nothing. Well, actually, I get this. The first minute goes by, and I'm thinking, wow, he's really showing me respect. He's thinking about this really hard. And by the way, that is a characteristic of Mark that's really admirable. He will think something all the way through before responding. At the 2-minute mark, though, I am really, really uncomfortable. Have you ever sat in a dead silent room for 2 minutes? It's really hard. At 3 minutes, I'm carving trenches in the upholstery of the furniture. And at 4 minutes, I'm ready to scream. Finally, he calms down. He goes, you won't believe this, but that story you just told, that's why I'm here. That exact thing just happened. Exactly the way you described it. How did you know? And I go, I didn't know. I just know all these people. This is how Silicon Valley works. They're all going to sell you out in a heartbeat. Anyway, he didn't want to sell the company. And so my contribution was to help him explain to everybody else why a company that was growing like a bat out of hell, that had plenty of capital, you know, he gets the founder gets to make the call, not the investors, right? And anyway, that began a 3-year period where I was one of his advisors. And I loved working with Mark. He was simply fantastic to work with. And look, there were signals that things weren't totally perfect, but I was convinced that he was smart enough in that he would seek out advice well enough that any problems could be fixed and surmounted. And the crowning thing I did was to bring Cheryl to his attention and help to shepherd her coming in as the chief operating officer. And I was convinced the two of them were going to be a great pair. And I was right about that part. What I missed was that there was a whole set of issues that the two of them together would be their worst enemy on. You know, when things went wrong, they weren't going to be a good pair. And that was not something I saw coming ahead of time, but obviously it came back to bite us.
Well, you know, in looking back, it turns out really early on that their company slogan was domination.
Well, it was move fast and break things, which, you know, I always thought was a joke. What I didn't realize was they took it literally. And no, seriously, they had this notion that if you didn't break things, you weren't moving fast enough. And there are a bunch of variants that have gone around Silicon Valley. And if you came from our world, which was the hippie world, it was hard to take that stuff seriously. It was hard to believe that anybody would think that was actually a legitimate way of running things. And in fairness to them, you know, I don't think they did it out of any bad things. They just had never been told by anybody that they were responsible for other people, right? They were never, the people who were in their lives basically said to them, you know, you're exceptional. You're smarter than other people. Go for it. You know, the rules don't apply to you. And for me, that didn't compute. And where I get really angry with myself is that I'm a professional analyst. And I missed some signals that things were coming off the rails. And part of the reason I became an activist was to make up for that.
By the way, though, it is my understanding that Mark Zuckerberg would sign off they'd end meetings and he'd sign off his emails with domination.
No.
Until one of the lawyers got involved and said, you know what, I think you have to stop that.
He was not the first guy to do that, though, okay? To be clear, Silicon Valley, almost every startup entrepreneur does that until the lawyers get involved. And the lawyers get involved for a really good reason, because if you're actually successful, the word domination is actually one of the trigger words for antitrust cases.
So, bringing things forward and leading us towards the book, what was the moment when you realized that despite all of the good intentions, and you know, Chris Hughes, who co-founded it, he says that, you know, Mark Zuckerberg's a great guy. Just this week was saying that, and it's not really about him, but although he wants to break up the company, what was the point in which you realized that something has changed here, or something is in the current context isn't working the way it had been initially intended?
So, first of all, Chris Hughes wrote this 6,000-word opinion piece in Sunday's New York Times. I really encourage you to read it. He was the fourth co-founder, always known as kind of the heart and soul of the company, the conscience of the company, maybe a better word. Very, very brave, really thoughtful. I'm incredibly supportive. So for me, I'm really embarrassed that it took me so long. I first saw a problem right after I retired. And I retired because the culture of Silicon Valley had really come off the rails. Basically, if you looked at the most successful startups of 2012, 13, 14, 15, they had one of two business models. One was, the laws don't apply to us, we're just going to break all the laws, move fast and break things. So that's Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, right? Just like the rules in their category, but they don't care. And then the other kind was the ones that said, wow, there are people in our world who really don't get what's going on. We can take advantage of them. So this is Uber and Lyft relative to the drivers. This is Spotify relative to artists. And it's, you know, the basically financial tech companies relative to consumers. And I'm just going, you know, I'm obviously too old. My value system doesn't work anymore. These things are going to be hugely successful. I can't invest in them because they violate my values, so I need to retire. So I retire at the end of 2015, and then immediately I start seeing things going wrong at Facebook. In the 2016 election, there was a Facebook group notionally associated with Bernie Sanders in the New Hampshire primary in January 2016. Really bad stuff. And that's the first time I realized, wow, somebody's paying money to get my friends into this Facebook group to spread really noxious disinformation. I'm almost certain it was the Russians. I haven't been able to prove it, but I'm almost certain. Then in March, there's a corporation that was using Facebook's ad tools to gather data about anyone who expressed an interest in Black Lives Matter, and they were selling the identity of those people to police departments. Now, Facebook did the right thing. They expelled them, but by the time they did it, the damage had been done. Thousands of people were being harassed by police departments. Then in June, the United Kingdom has the vote on the European Union, what they call Brexit. And that's when I realized, oh my God, the same ad tools that make marketers so successful can be used in an election to distort the outcome, where you can essentially take advantage of the emotional triggers that make a post viral on Facebook to amplify the most inflammatory messages in a political campaign. So essentially it gave this massive advantage to the more negative campaign, which I just thought was bad for democracy. And that's when I start looking for friends. I go, there's something really wrong here. And I can't find any until September. I get invited to do an op-ed for the Recode blog, Kara Swisher, and Walt Mossberg. So I get invited to do this thing, and I'm writing it. And that's when we learn that the Department of Housing and Urban Development has cited Facebook because its tools allow for discrimination in housing. And then a week later, we find out that the Russians are trying to interfere in our election. At that point, I realize I can't write an op-ed. I got to reach out to Mark and Cheryl. So I send them the draft op-ed 9 days before the election. And I'm saying to them, guys, there is something about the business model. There's something about the algorithms that's letting bad people hurt innocent people, and you got to get on top of it. So I'm doing this as a friend, right? But they treat it like a PR problem, like I'm the PR problem. And they pass me off to one of their colleagues, and I have 2 or 3 conversations with him before the election. And he keeps going, Roger, we're cool. I'm going, what do you mean you're cool? I got 2 massive civil rights violations and 2 elections elsewhere that you may be a factor in. This is not cool. He goes, no, the law says we're a platform. We're not a media company. We're not responsible for what third parties do. And I'm looking at him going, are you kidding me? And then the election happens, and then I freak out completely. And I basically go, look, you gotta do what Johnson & Johnson did in 1982. Some guy put poison in bottles of Tylenol in Chicago, Illinois. And the CEO of Johnson & Johnson doesn't wait around for somebody to tell him. He pulls every bottle off of every shelf of every retail store. And they don't put it back until they invent and deploy tamper-proof packaging. This is what Boeing should have done on the 737 MAX, and this is what I advised Facebook to do in November, December, January, and the beginning of February of 2016 into 2017. And they just go, not our problem. The law says we're cool. And I'm going, you're a trust business, pal. You have got to protect the people who use your product. What's wrong with American business is that they've forgotten that consumers are their friends. They depend on them. They got to treat them with respect. Anyway, that's when I realized I was faced with a choice. I was retired. I could have sat back and said, no, somebody else needs to deal with it. But I'm not wired that way. And it turns out, I looked at this and I said, I'm involved in this. I played a small but important role in Facebook. My investors made a lot of money from it. this is my moment. If I don't stand up on this issue, what would I stand up on? My job is to make people aware of what I know, to do what I'm doing right now. And so I started doing that in February of 2017. And what a long, strange trip. I'm not a natural activist. This is something you should all know. I'm not a natural politician. I'm not a natural activist. And what I'm doing now is some of each. And it's the most depressing thing on earth most of the time. But what's really beautiful is I'm making eye contact with people again. I used to have my whole life mediated by technology, but I'm doing something that's important, and I'm making eye contact with human beings again. And I can't overstate how profoundly encouraging that is.
Let me ask you, so bringing this back to music, and I think a lot of people here maybe
Yeah.
are grappling with this one issue, in that let's say they don't want to support these particular practices.
This is brutal,
so,
right?
So what do you do when you want to get the word out about your band? And that's
People say, Roger, why are you still on Facebook? I go, my fucking band lives on Facebook. I got 420,000 followers who really, nice number, right? We've been stuck at that number for a couple of years, and I don't know why, but it's like, where do you go? They have a monopoly. I have a book that's targeted at people who are on Instagram and Facebook. I gotta advertise on Instagram and Facebook. No, these guys are monopolists. And this is what makes this so difficult, which is why I really believe because there's no way around them, we have to use politics to force changes in the business model. There are problems with the product, but the real issues, the things that I'm talking about, are things about this notion, the Pokemon Go problem. It's this notion of Alexa. It's this idea that corporations feel like they are entitled to invade your most private spaces, record what happens there, and then use that for their own economic benefit. That's what we have to fight. And that we can do politically, because it turns out it's not a partisan issue. It's not about right and left. It's about right and wrong. And let me give you an example. Anybody here use Gmail? Yeah. Well, let me tell you what the problem is with Gmail. Google decided very early on that their real business wasn't advertising. Their real business was behavioral prediction. And let me explain how it works. When you see a TV ad for cars or you see a billboard for cars, 99% of the people who see the ad or the billboard have no interest in buying a car now, right? So that's wasted, right? Behavioral prediction is about knowing when is the moment that people are going to buy a car. And because Google and Facebook touch literally all of us, they look when people buy a car and then look at the 1,000 steps that come before that. And their goal is to sell, quote, an ad, unquote, right, at the moment when the outcome is certain, and to price it accordingly. So instead of a penny per 1,000, it's $500 per customer, right? So they're in the certainty business. Well, in order to do that, they have to have perfect information. So they create this data voodoo doll that consists not just of the stuff you put in, but much more importantly, they track you everywhere you go on the web, right? They buy all this data from banks and credit card processors and cellular companies, right? They track you with all these different products like Alexa. But Google does one step better. They realized when they formed Gmail that the best single source of insight about people's behavior was their email, because they told you what they're planning to do. The problem is they're a platform, not a media company in their mind, which means it's illegal to do that, right? If you're a phone company and you listen to people's conversations, if you're the Postal Service and you read somebody's letters, that's a felony. You go to jail. So Google had to find a way around that. And so what they did was they said, we'll make it a free service. We'll put in ads. We'll scan the emails in order to put the ads and make them more relevant. Problem is, we hated the ads, so they pull the ads out, but they're still scanning your email. It should be illegal. And we can use the election process to make that happen. Every candidate's going to come to New York for president, for Congress, for the Senate. You're going to see people up the yin-yang. They all come to New York for money. Get in their grill and say, I want you to stop Microsoft and Google from scanning messages and documents. I want you to stop everybody from spying on me and gathering my personal data. I want you to stop third parties from trading my private data, right? We can do that. It's no different than what we've done in the past with things like the robber barons. And none of this is inevitable, people. None of it. I mean, 6 months ago, I couldn't get 10 people in a room. My average audience now is a couple of hundred, right? In bookstores, it's like crazy. And it's because people care. This is your life. This is not about, hey, I'm a digital native. My data's out there, I don't care. This is about the fact that if you were in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, you didn't need to be on Facebook to be dead. You just need to be in the wrong synagogue. If you were in Christchurch, New Zealand, you just need to be in the wrong mosque. If you were in Myanmar, you just needed to be a Rohingya. This stuff has consequences, right? If you're a DACA kid today, the outcome of the election has really affected your life. If you're an immigrant, it's really affected your life. And my point here is this isn't about our data affecting us. This is about our data being used against other people and other people's data being used against us and corporations who control. Remember, think about it this way. The people they sell to, the guys who buy certainty, have perfect information about you. What do you have? You have the data that Facebook and Google let you see. And you think, well, I got my full range of choices. No, you have the ones they let you see. I'll give you an example. It's illegal today to discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions in healthcare. You know what's not illegal? To use Facebook advertising tools so that the people with pre-existing conditions never see the opportunities to sign up for the right health plan. That really goes on. You know what else is not illegal? You buy a smart car, you're an hour late for your payment, and the car doesn't start because they can control that. You know what else is not illegal? You get one of those little dongles from a car insurance company, you put it in there, you get your 5% off, but your kid drives the car at 95 miles an hour on Friday night, your insurance rates go up. You are not the customer. I am not the customer. Dean is not the customer. We're the fuel. And I just think we need to have a conversation about that, and we can't let any politician come through this campaign without making a stand, right? And so far, we got a few. We got Elizabeth Warren, who's been really aggressive and really smart on this issue. We got Amy Klobuchar, who's more cautious, but nonetheless directionally correct on it. We heard the beginnings of something from Kamala Harris. Maybe we heard the beginnings of something from Cory Booker, maybe not sure. My point is, my job is to get them all in the right place. I'm also working with the administration. I'm working with the antitrust division of the Justice Department, a Trump appointee. I'm working with the Federal Trade Commission, Trump appointees. And you know what I've discovered? Like I said, this isn't about right and left. This is about right and wrong. Everybody gets it. I was on Fox and Friends this morning, right? And you go, whoa. And I go, yeah. Why? Because it turns out everybody cares, okay? And this is an issue that's not partisan. This is a place where we can all come together, but we got to do something about it. It's like registering to vote, right? To me, when you sign up for head count, you ought to sign up to send a message to your elected officials to fix this problem, because it turns out that if we can fix this part, we're going to fix most of what's wrong on essentially the polarization of the country. We're going to fix a lot of what's wrong with violent extremists, being drawn to do violent extremism. We're going to do a lot to reduce the number of killings in schools. And we're going to protect kids from having their brains manipulated from birth to adulthood.
So I'm going to open this up in a moment for questions, but I'm curious, it seemed like, if someone was paying attention, that Mark Zuckerberg sort of owned this issue in certain respects, and at least acknowledging some fault. So what's your take on that?
I really give Mark a lot of credit for engaging in the political conversation, and I really contrast him with the founders and the CEO of Google are pretending like, hey, we're not part of this, right? New York Times let the CEO of Google write a completely ridiculous op-ed going, Facebook talks about privacy, we really do it, trust me. You know how he's lying? He wrote an op-ed. I mean, it is complete misdirection, everything in that thing. Don't believe it. So here's the problem. Mark is doing exactly what a public relations professional would tell him to do, which is conceding stuff that he doesn't care about to create the illusion of cooperation. If you don't change the business model, you can't fix the problem. There is no number of moderators. Think about it this way. They started out going, hey, we'll let the users determine what we're going to keep on. If you don't like it, you tell us and we'll take it down. Well, that didn't work. So they said, well, we'll use AI. And that worked sort of in a few areas, but it was a disaster in hate speech. So they said, okay, we'll hire 20,000 people in the Philippines and we'll pay them like 9 cents an hour and they'll read all this horrible stuff and we'll take that down. That doesn't work, okay? It doesn't work because the products are huge and more importantly, the way they keep you on the site, the way they create economic value is by stimulating the most basic emotions. And the ones that create the most engagement are ones based on outrage and fear. So it turns out that hate speech and disinformation and conspiracy theories, that is what drives the economic value of the business. It's not like they promote hate speech on purpose. They promote the stuff that people engage with most, and we cannot help but engage with hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. It's reflexive. It's part of our flight or fight tendency. And they know that. And until you eliminate that, I don't want them in the censorship business. I don't want the government determining who can publish what. What I want to do is end the practice of algorithmic boosting of hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. I mean, that's what you have to do. And that changes their business model hugely. There is no way around it. And you know what? Tough noogies. They're the most successful people in history. It's time to take one for the team.
Fair enough. So does anyone have a question?
Well, hang on just a sec. I have a tradition. I always start with the ladies. So could we have a woman before we begin, and then we'll go to the gentleman? Please, ma'am.
This was fascinating, thank you. Just fascinating to hear you talk about all this stuff. I'm curious to hear a little bit what you think. Obviously, you mentioned the kind of changing the algorithms and things. I guess, first of all, what can existing companies who violate this stuff do? And secondly, who are some companies who do a really good job of protecting data?
Oh, this is a really great question. So did everybody hear it? Basically, who does a good job and what are we all supposed to do? So let me start with who does a good job because that's a partial answer. So today, there are the guys who you have to watch out for in order of seriousness are Google, Facebook, then a little bit further down, but rising rapidly, Amazon and Microsoft. Those are the 4 bad actors. And bad actors in the sense that they believe in the use of data to create certainty and manipulate people's behavior. Apple is the only company that is in the hardware business who's really attempting to build a model around protecting the personal rights and safety of the people who use their product. Apple is not perfect, but they are so much better than Android. Android is genuinely dangerous. Go search on YouTube for Oracle Android test, I think it is. Oracle did this thing where they disconnected the cellular and the operating system from an Android phone and discovered it could still track you and knew where you were, what you were doing, and generally speaking, if you were with other people. I mean, this is without an operating system and without cellular. I mean, Android is just a collection of sensors designed to gather data. And here's the problem with it. It's going into every smart TV, every smart appliance, every smart car. Okay? You can't avoid it. You cannot turn on a brand new Sony TV without agreeing to let Oracle listen to what you're doing and use that information. Now, you can spike the microphone, but that's what you have to do. And so what's wrong with this whole thing is that problem. Netflix is the one which has, like Apple, the biggest store of data. So far, they're using it constructively, so I don't have an issue with them. There are no alternatives at the platform level, equivalently large to the big 4, but you can use different products. I use DuckDuckGo as my search engine. I use Ghostery, Safari. You could use the Brave browser. Those are all browser options. I use one password to log in, never use Facebook Connect. You definitely need tracking blockers. You need ad blockers. You need all those things. You can whitelist Relix so that you can see their ads, but you have to block the tracking, okay? The tracking is really dangerous, and there's a lot of bad actors out there, okay? This is a really hard thing. In the book, I talk a lot about this issue, but it's a constant struggle, and there's no good answer today. You have to accept more inconvenience. These guys use convenience, the elimination of friction, to maintain their hold on us. Here's the thing. Life itself depends on friction. You cannot procreate without it, okay? My point to you is, if convenience is the only thing that matters to you, we're screwed, okay? Because they're trying to use convenience to numb you. If you read Aldous Huxley, this is Soma, okay? Okay, now we can have a man.
Thanks, Roger, for your time. This kind of piggybacks on her question, but I've read a lot of Tim Wu recently, and Tim has an idea that perhaps the internet itself is a different platform than other communication technologies that have been monopolized, and there's a possibility to basically innovate out of any problem that we've had. But then most recently, he published a book saying that essentially the internet in its current state needs the antitrust laws in America more than ever. So my question to you is, and I guess the answer might be both, but I'm interested in you elaborating on it. What combination of innovation within the private sector and innovation or use of the political process?
This is really important.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, Tim Wu is a professor at Columbia who wrote the definitive book on the development of persuasive technologies called The Attention Merchants. And his real thing is about antitrust law, and he is one of the absolute stars in that world. So the essential problem you have today is that the market has failed, and it's failed really dramatically. Any world in which Jeff Bezos can get divorced and still be the richest human being on earth is a world with a policy failure, okay? I mean, there's just, the rewards for success in this category are too large. Think of it this way. I believe internet platforms are like the chemical industry was 50 years ago, back when it was legal to pour mercury into fresh water, to leave mine tailings on the side of a hill, or for a gas station to pour spent oil into the sewer. There are externalities they are not paying for, and the question is, how do you stop that? One piece is you've got to do what I recommend, which is to change the business model. But the other problem is you've got to create an alternative, and that's the thing that they're stifling today. If you think about artificial intelligence, roughly 70% of all the people in AI work for Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Amazon, and they're all working to a first approximation on behavioral manipulation. And they say, you can't regulate us because you need us to compete with China. And I'm going, what the hell are you talking about? All China wants to do is behavioral manipulation. Why are we in America thinking behavioral manipulation is a good idea? It's a terrible idea. And these guys are essentially blocking the opportunity for startups by raising the price artificially high. They have all these interlocking patent deals that essentially block any startup from getting going. So we need to use antitrust law to create space. We have models. We went through this with AT&T. With AT&T, we did two really smart things before we broke them up. The first was we got their entire patent portfolio put effectively into the public domain so anybody could use it. That's what created Silicon Valley. It put the transistor into the public domain. We need to do that to the patent portfolios of all four of those guys. We also need to do what we did with AT&T on long distance. We wanted to have competition. So we said, AT&T, you're going to have to give MCI and Sprint access to your long distance network for essentially nothing. And we build competitors on the network. And the way we do that here is we go, look, it's way too complicated from a privacy point of view to have data portability. So instead, we're going to let you build your audience for free. Say the first 100 million users on a new company with the correct business model, you'd get for free over whichever one of Facebook and Google was the correct guy for the market you were going after, okay? So think about it that way. These are all models that exist out there. The point here is we're not going to do this with a market solution. We're not going to do this by trusting to self-regulation. We have attempted to do that, and we've destroyed democracy in the United States, the United Kingdom. We've threatened it all across Europe. We've had massive, issues of hate speech in Asia, Europe, and the United States. And these guys have just sat back and done nothing. And it's time to bring a hammer down.
One last question? Somebody? Yeah.
Just a couple quick thank yous. First to you, Dean, for teaching me a couple weeks back what the difference between a tuba and a sousaphone was at the that New Orleans talk we had. And then Roger, thank you for that Moon Alice Tea Leaf Green poster I still have in my bedroom from about 10 years ago, May Day poster. But my question is to you, Roger, can you offer any insight about the Ice Bucket Challenge or the Coney viral video and Facebook's role in that from years ago? And is there anything sinister about that?
Here's the thing I would say to you, is that the algorithms do all of that kind of work. They promote things that are engaging. There is an opportunity for people at Facebook or Google to influence the outcome on that stuff. And for the most part, they've done so by doing things that stimulate engagement. And I can't speak specifically to the Ice Bucket Challenge. What I can tell you is that there was an expose in, I want to say it was Bloomberg recently, where they went into YouTube and discovered that the staff inside YouTube had been warning the management team for a couple of years that the things they were doing in the algorithms to promote the most engaging content was having a massive, explosive impact on hate speech and on conspiracy theories like flat Earth. And the management team consciously ignored it because they're totally driven by metrics. And this brings me to the point I want to absolutely share with you, which is that business has lost its mind. We have forgotten the 5 stakeholders that really matter: shareholders, employees, the communities where employees live, customers and suppliers. That was the mantra of every manager as recently as the late 90s. Now we only care about shareholders, and that means all your decisions are like a nanosecond long, right? And then the other problem that you've got, and it's really, it's so disappointing, but we run everything according to metrics. We're only guided by making metrics. And engineers love metrics. The problem is, if you run everything according to metrics, there's no room for ethics. Because ethics, by definition, is the subordination of a metric to a higher value. And if you run everything only according to metrics, that means your customers are a metric, human beings are a metric, everything becomes a metric, and nothing matters anymore. And that's where you wound up with YouTube, with Facebook and Instagram, where all content is just content. So the New York Times story is equivalent to something totally phony made up by a kid in Macedonia, right? They're all treated exactly the same, where hate speech is treated as legitimate as a real news story. And that is deeply, deeply wrong. And I think we have to fix that value system. We have to get back to remembering all the stakeholders who matter. And I take great comfort from what happened in the last year. The 2018 elections saw massive increase in turnout from the 3 groups that were most heavily suppressed by Bannon and the Republicans in 2016. Suburban white women, people of color, and idealistic young people. They all turned out in huge numbers. We have to keep that going. There have been 60 successful teacher labor actions in the last year. Stop and Shop had the first successful labor action against an industrial company in, I don't know how many years, maybe decades. And the air traffic controllers ended the government shutdown with a 2-hour partial walkout. And then the March for Our Lives, right? You have all this people are getting active again. That's what we have to do. It's not enough to just register to vote. You got to make your voice heard. You got to get in there. You not only have to vote, you got to march. You got to speak out. You got to confront members of Congress. You got to confront local government people. Okay? This stuff really matters.
Let's leave it at that. Can't do much better than that. Roger McNamee.
So, can I close with one thought?
Sure, go ahead. Pick up his book, Zuck, by the way. I've read it.
I want to close with one thought. I want to thank you. You guys are braver than you realize. Facebook and Google both know you're here with me today. They're going to follow you for the rest of your life. So you might as well join the rebellion now because you're part of it. Thank you all for coming out.